This video will show how to create the following two small Swift programs. First, creating a new Swift file in an empty directory, implementing it with a trivial program, printing the classical phrase "Hello World" to the screen. Then the Hello World program will be replaced with another program, which receives input argument from the command line and also receives keyboard input from the user. This video is part of at least one playlist showing how to do the above with different programming languages. There should be a link to that playlist in the description below. Prerequisites. You, the viewer of this video, are assumed to have some skills in at least some programming language. I will not explain basic concepts such as what is a variable or what is an array or what is a for loop. Even if you have never written source code with Swift, you are assumed to be able to understand, for example, what this Swift code below does. In this video, I am using Windows 10, which is certainly not the most common operating system for Swift programming, but it is now possible to use Swift for Windows if you have installed Visual Studio 2019. I have installed Swift by following the instructions on the web page shown here. According to the web page, Swift has been tested with Visual Studio 2019, and in this video I am using Visual Studio 2019. However, I have also tested on a computer with Windows 10, which only has Visual Studio 2022 installed, but not Visual Studio 2019, and it also worked. I am now starting a command window with a shortcut called x64 Native Tools Command Prompt for VS 2019. Now I am showing which version I have installed, and as you can see, it is Swift 552. Now I navigate into an existing but empty directory called f:\dev. The Windows command dir shows that I am starting from an empty directory. Now I create a new directory called Swift with the Windows command md. Then I navigate into the new directory with cd swift. Then I start Visual Studio Code by typing code and a dot, which is the path to the current directory. When Visual Studio Code has started, I create a new Swift file, arguments_inputs.swift, in the new Swift directory. You do not have to put the code in a function or a class with the main method, which is needed in many other programming languages. You can instead write code in the file directly on the file global level, outside of any function or method in a class. I am implementing the initial trivial Hello World program by calling the print function to print Hello World on the screen. Then I show with the Windows command dir that the Swift file has been created in the Swift directory. Then I try to compile the program with the Swift compiler, swiftc, and the file name. But then an error message is displayed. I try again, and now I add the flag SDK, and then an environment variable, SDK root, that was created when I installed Swift. Now the compilation worked. When I run the command dir, you can see that a file has been created with almost the same name, but without any file extension. It is the executable file, but when using Windows, such files usually have the file extension .exe. Therefore, I compile again, and this time I also add the flag -o, and then the desired name of the executable file, including the file extension .exe. When I now run the command dir again, you can see that an .exe file has now been created. When I execute the .exe file, you can see that the program shows Hello World on the screen, just as expected. Regarding the environment variable SDK root, you can use the Windows command echo to see which directory it points to. Now I will replace the initial Hello World implementation with a program that will receive and print arguments from the command line. The program will also ask the user to enter a name, and will then print to the screen what the user typed. For this purpose, I have prepared some pseudocode that I will paste into the program, but in comments, because of course it would not be possible to execute. Then I will modify the code by changing it to Swift code that can be executed. Now I am showing how the program arguments will be provided to the program when it is executed. The arguments are added after the name of the executable file and then a space between each argument. So here I am showing 3 arguments for the program. Any program arguments are available in an array called arguments in an enum enumeration called command line. I will iterate that array with a for loop, and I choose arg as the name of the iterated element. Inside the loop, the iterated program argument is printed to the screen by calling print. The string is created with so-called string interpolation, with the backslash as prefix and then the variable name within parentheses. Then I compiled the modified program. When I then execute the program with 3 arguments, it does not work quite as expected. The very first so-called argument contains the name of the file being executed. Since I wanted to print only the actual program arguments, I would change the code so that the first element in the array is not printed. Therefore, I changed to a for loop that iterates through the index of the array, from 1 to the upper limit defined by the property commandline.arguments.count. Most programming languages, including Swift, start array indexing at 0 for the first element, which means that 1 is the second element. That is, when you're specifying 1, then you're skipping the first element with index 0. The 3 dots is a so-called closed range operator, which includes the upper limit, the value to the right of ... However, when you iterate an array with the count property, you do not want to include that number as the upper limit, since the array index starts at 0. Therefore, you can instead use ... less than character, which is a so-called half-open range operator, which does not include the value to the right of the operator as the upper limit. I also changed the string in the loop so that I refer to the array element in commandline.arguments with the index I in square brackets. Now I compile the program again. When I then execute, it works exactly as expected. Note that now the .exe file is not printed as a first program argument. If you look in the documentation for Swift, you can see that there is a static property there, commandline.argc, of the type int32. And a reasonable assumption would be that you could use it instead of using commandline.arguments.count, so therefore I am not trying to do that. But when I compile, an error message is displayed that requires the type to be int. Therefore, I changed the code by converting commandline.argc to an int. When I then compile again, it works without any error message. Now I will also add some code that shows the type of the variable commandline.argc when it is not converted to an int. I print the type to the screen by using the function type, which takes an argument named of for the variable you want to check the type of. When I compile and execute the program again, it works as before regarding the iteration that shows all program arguments. It is also shown that the property type for commandline.argc is int32, and with that type the for loop did not work. But when you instead use a type that is an int, then the for loop works. When you look in the documentation for int, you can see that the type is the same size as int32 on a 32-bit platform, but on a 64-bit platform, it is the same size as an int64. Now I will implement the second part of the program, receiving input from the keyboard while the program is executed. The question, "What is your name?" is printed to the screen with the print function. I use the function readLine to read input from the keyboard. That function returns the string that the user entered, and I receive it into a variable name. Then I print the variable name to the screen by using the function print and the text hello as prefix. Again, I am using so-called string interpolation with backslash and then the variable name in parentheses. Now I compile the program. Then a warning is displayed suggesting a default value for the variable name. The problem is that the return type for the function readLine is a so-called optional string, which I will show a little later in this video. Such an optional string can contain the special value nil instead of a string. Therefore, I add some code which will make the return value to always be a string by letting it instead be an empty string if it would not have a string value, if it would be equal to nil. This can be done with the help of the so-called nil coalescing operator with two question marks, and then an empty string as the default value to use if the value to the left of the operator would be equal to nil. Then I compile again, and now no warning is displayed. When I then execute, it does not work exactly as I wanted. I want the input prompt to appear at the end of the same line as the text, "What is your name?" instead of appearing on a new line below. Therefore, I use an additional argument for the print function called terminator, and there I use an empty string instead of the default value, which is a line break character, \n. Then I compile the program again. And when I execute the program this time, the input prompt appears at the end of the line where the text "What is your name?" is printed. Regarding that the function readLine returns an optional string, you can check it in the documentation, but you can also verify it by using a programmatic type check, which I will now show. Just like before, when I checked that commandline.argc has the type int32, I now use the function type with the argument of, but this time for the variable name. When I then compile and execute the program, you can see that the printed type is an optional string. Now I restore the code in the file, which I will soon copy to another file in a generated project. So far, I have used the compiler swiftc to compile a source file into an exe file that can be executed. But now I will show how to create a project or a so-called package, which can be executed in another way. Now I create a new directory called myswiftpackage with the Windows command md, and then navigate into that directory with the command cd. Then I use the command swiftpackageInit with the flag type executable. Then you can see that some files are generated, for example a file named main.swift in a subdirectory. Now I switch to Visual Studio Code and copy the code I created earlier and paste the code into the file main.swift, which I just generated. Then I compile the program with the command swiftbuild. Then you can see that an .exe file was created in a subdirectory with a long path. I copy the relative path based on the current directory myswiftpackage so that I can paste the path to the command prompt to execute the program. I add some program arguments in the same way as before, with a space between each argument. As you can see, the program works in exactly the same way as before.